So now we're going to talk about memory and look at memory rehabilitation. So we'll look at the theories behind it, what we understand of the brain areas, and then some strategies around rehabilitation. So in terms of understanding memory, memory has been written about since the Greeks and the Romans, probably if not before, but it wasn't until the 1890s with William James in the United States that, I suppose in modern times, there's recognition that there's more than one type of thing going on when we talk about memory. And William James talked about there seeming to be a memory for the here and now, and maybe a separate memory for things that were long ago. And that's the first real mention of what we now know as short-term memory and long-term memory. And it wasn't until the 1960s, the late 1960s, with Atkinson and Shiffrin, and they did a lot of work on short-term memory. And what they found was that short-term memory is a very limited capacity, and you need to consciously rehearse information in it. And one of their big contributions was discovering that the capacity of somebody's short-term memory is about 7 bits of information. So they said 7 plus or minus 2. It's not until the late 1980s then that people started looking in more detail at long-term memory. And Tolving and colleagues elaborated on this, and they proposed that there was actually 3 subtypes here. So there's semantic memory, procedural memory, and episodic memory, all within long-term memory. And by the late 1980s, Tolving had access to functional brain scans. So they were able to put people into scanners and give them tasks to do, and then they worked out what parts of the brain were responsible for people performing those tasks. But as a result of this, they identified those 3 areas. So semantic memory is your memory for facts and meanings. So who was the leader of the Germans in World War II? That's a semantic memory. Or what road sign is octagonal and red and has white writing on it? It'd be a stop sign, but that's a semantic memory. Procedural memory then is memory where there's a very strong motor component to it. So driving a car, the mechanics of that would be a procedural memory. Or somebody who learns a martial art, a lot of that skill is procedural memory skill because it's motor control, motor based. And then lastly, episodic memory, which is what people think of when you think of memory, and that's remembering the episodes of your life. So now to think a bit about the brain areas that we know are involved in memory, and the major ones would be the hippocampus, which are deep inside your temporal lobes on the left and right side. And we've known for the last 70 years that the hippocampus was really critically important in people's ability to form memories because of somebody who was known as HM in the literature, but his name is Henry Gustav Moliasen, born in 1926 and died in 2008. And he was from Connecticut in the United States, and he had intractable epilepsy, which some sources say came on after he fell off a bike as a young man. And he essentially had bilateral temporal lobe surgery where they removed both of his hippocampuses because they were implicated in the seizures that he was having. So he had both hippocampi removed, and then from that point on was effectively unable to form new memories. So he was very much studied from the surgery took place in 1953, from the late 50s until his death in 2008. So with HM and the removal bilaterally of his hippocampi, we knew that they were heavily involved in people's ability to form memories, but we still didn't understand why. And it's not until the late 1990s and the discovery of something called neurogenesis that question was answered. This was effectively an accidental discovery while trying to search for a marker that would show cancer cells, and it worked very well for cancer cells, but was also showing new cells in the hippocampus and some other brain areas. And effectively what's happening is, as an adult, your hippocampus is producing new cells throughout your lifespan, which would not have been understood or expected before this discovery. And it's by producing those new cells that you can record new memories over time. This is also important in terms of Alzheimer's disease because we know that in Alzheimer's, the brain areas that are initially impacted first are effectively the hippocampus. And we know this from studies by, for example, Ariagda. Similarly, for post-traumatic stress disorder, there's an implication that those brain areas may be smaller in people who've had PTSD for, say, 20 years. So Vietnam veterans who were looked at in the mid-90s with brain scans had people who had PTSD seem to have smaller hippocampuses. And it wasn't understood whether this was always the case that maybe made them vulnerable to getting PTSD, or whether this is what somebody's brain looks like if they've had PTSD for 20 years. And the question was somewhat answered anyway with the London taxi driver study from 2000, where they found that London taxi drivers had larger hippocampuses than average people. So now to think about some of the strategies that we would use in terms of rehabilitation of memory problems for people with brain injury. Some of the considerations are, if you think back to the Atkinson and Schifrin research from the 60s, where they said that your short-term memory had a capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. What you have to bear in mind is, for somebody who's a brain injury, it's not going to be 7, it could be 2 or 3 or 1 bit of information. And then to think about something called the primacy effect and the recency effect, which is really a very normal part of human memory, where if our system is overloaded with, say, 15 or 16 bits of information, much more than the 7, what will happen is you'll remember the first few and the last few, and all the middle piece will be gone. But there is a learning curve potentially, so if people go over information a number of times, they can learn it and a little bit extra each time. And then the other piece to think about is something called interference. And this happens when, if you're trying to learn a piece of information and you switch and you try and learn something else, you get interference, which happens in 2 ways. The first way is proactive interference, where you will find it harder to switch and learn the second set of information because you're just after putting in effort on the first set. And there's retroactive interference, where you will now forget some of the stuff, the first stuff that you learned, because you've switched to try and learn a new set of things. So in terms of working with people with brain injuries, what that means is remembering that the capacity of information is going to be lower. So really you're talking about giving somebody 2 or 3 bits of information max. Bear in mind, if you overload them with a lot, they'll remember the beginning and the end and forget the middle. And if you ask somebody to do something and then you switch immediately to a new task, they'll find the new task harder than they should, and they'll probably forget parts of what they just did. So we need to mention internal memory strategies here, because these are, you'll see them in the research literature and you'll hear people talk about them. And they're effectively training people's own internal memory to try and compensate for the brain injury problems. So these would be the kind of strategies like don't learn off what you don't understand, relate the information to what you know already, break it down into several parts, take a break after 30 or 40 minutes, don't try and take in too much information at once, and look at the information a number of times, and you will eventually get a learning curve. But the reality is, I think that for people with brain injuries, those sorts of internal memory strategies just aren't good enough. And certainly when you get to the point of the injury being moderate or severe, people need something else that's going to work for them in the real world. So we'll have to talk about external memory strategies. And in this case, you're looking at things like a written diary or a journal, and maybe a whiteboard or a wall calendar or yellow sticky notes. But probably now in the 21st century, we should be thinking about things like mobile phones, any kind of electronic memory aid, Alexa. All of these electronic memory aids have the ability to set reminders, and they will help with something called prospective memory. And so what is prospective memory? So prospective memory is remembering to do something in the future. There's 2 aspects to it. So there's a retrospective part and a prospective part. The retrospective part is remembering what it is that you need to do. So for example, I need to phone the social worker. The prospective part of that is that in response to the right contact that I actually do phone the social worker. So you can think of it as there being 5 stages in that sequence of prospective memory. For the first piece then is encoding of the intention and the action. So that's, I'll ring the social worker. The second bit is a retention interval. So that might be later on today, a few hours away, or it might be after the weekend that I need to ring them. And so there's a performance interval, which is where hopefully I'll make the phone call. And then finally the performance is evaluated. So I either made the call or I forgot. But there's different factors that influence how likely I am to realise that delayed intention of ringing the social worker. And the first one would be the complexity of the task. So if it's simply just a ring our own social worker here, that might be straightforward. But if I need to go to a file and find a phone number and find some details and check other stuff and then ring a social worker in a different organisation, the level of complexity there makes it a bit more tricky. Maybe I won't get it done. The second thing is the strength of intention to perform the action. So if it doesn't really matter and I can ring them at any point next week or today. Will I have rung them by the end of next week? Maybe, maybe not. But if there was a big child protection concern and a really strong intention to ring them, that means I'm much more likely to do it. And the third thing is a retrieval context. So in this case, me ringing the social worker might be when I get back to the office, and that hopefully will cue me to, right, I need to make that phone call. But if I don't go back to the office and I don't get that cue, it makes it a bit less likely that I remember in a different situation that I have to make that call. So as part of this discussion, when you think about substitutive training and versus compensation, or retraining versus compensation. So Barbara Wilson, the famous neuropsychologist, concluded in the late 90s that there was a distinct lack of evidence that retraining through exercise is effective. She said that cognitive retraining fails to address functional manifestations of problems experienced by brain injury people in real life. So she said it was tackling impairments as measured by tests rather than disabilities as measured by problems in real life. And I think a good example of that would be Solberg and Mateer's very, very comprehensive and well thought out prospective memory training program, which had several publications in the mid-90s. And through an awful lot of work, they were able to show that you could increase somebody's prospective memory through retraining from, a few minutes up to maybe an hour, a couple of hours or something like that. But that's no good in the real world when people need to be able to remember information for 2 or 3 days or 2 weeks. So a shift now in emphasis has occurred since then. So that shift in emphasis about substitutive training versus compensation, Wilson and Powell in '94 commented, rather than ask the question of how can I improve a person's memory, because you're probably not going to be able to do that, it's usually more profitable to ask what is the best way for this person to retain new information by any means. And really the goal in rehabilitation is to train the person to use their intact abilities to overcome the problems and to capitalise on old learning from before the brain injury. So in conclusion, in this short video we've talked about some of the theories around memory. So we've understood that there's short-term memory, that there's long-term memory. Within long-term memory there's semantic, episodic and procedural. We've looked at some of the brain areas involved, particularly the hippocampus. And then we've also looked at some real-world rehabilitation strategies, which can include effectively externalizing memory and using systems of prompts for people with brain injuries.